Just like a really quick overview. So sensory integration, sensory processing can impact initiating peer interactions, developing relationships and daily activities, and regulating arousal. At best, there's emerging but limited evidence, with few positive outcomes and some null or negative, as in like this is not going to work, which you don't often see either. Because there's limited and inconclusive results. There's short-term results, lasts for a month or a week or a day, and then it goes away. Small number of studies and lack of credible studies. But still, this is frequently used in the clinics, despite this evidence. So in addition to, trying to do this tracking of using naturalistic behavioral interventions in play to kind of get that process, better understand how do we capture that process, not this like individual intervention or individual item, as though a lot of this is for future research. I also think it's really important for us to really think about how we track what we're doing, and use this model of testing. So I'm curious if anybody has any thoughts on this. This was a really challenging article. I think what makes it so challenging is what we do is really complex, and we should give ourselves some credit for that. It's a lot of heavy neuroscience, and it's a lot of things working at the same time, which makes it hard to capture in a research study, is basically the nutshell. So this is, the best way we have right now to be able to track, really break down, we move kids from sensory to motor to social to behavior, and make sure that our interventions are doing that. Okay. So some of the comments, does anybody want to share out loud?
Basically, what I just inserted into the chat was some background about air sensory treatment. So I got trained through USC, which is University of Southern California. They have a center there that is focused on training in like air sensory integration, as it was like meant to be, because that's where she came out of and did her neuroscience related research. So the key things really with ASI is that it's a trademarked protocol. So they don't want you saying that you're doing it unless you're doing it per the protocol. A lot of the components of the protocol are things that we're incorporating kind of day to day, like the flexibility kind of in our space and opportunities for children to be challenged, but also be engaged and intrinsically motivated to engage with you and play. However, a lot of the components that are key and like kind of central to AIRS are things that a lot of people are not doing when they're providing sensory processing related treatment. So one of the keys being really that it's 100% child-led. Another two things that I don't think most people are aware of that I just figured would be worth bringing up. AIRS protocol necessitates that a child is seen at least 3 times a week, which in almost no settings is actually happening. There's a big focus too on family participation, and the idea obviously with more being better is that the more intensive treatment in a short period of time can be more helpful, which we all know is absolutely true based on other protocols that are focused on high intensity of treatment. But again, not something that's happening in daily practice. The third thing being that there's actually quite a lot of rules about what the environment has to be looking like when you're offering AIRS treatment. So in almost no setting that I've never worked in an environment that even meets all the criteria. For example, like I literally pulled up some of my training so that I could reference it exactly. So for example, they have to have 3 points of suspension from the ceiling, so at least 3. I've never worked in an environment that had more than 2, because if you think about it, that's a very large space in order for that to be safe. And one of them has to allow for the ability to rotate up to 360 degrees, which again is not necessarily something I've seen a lot of. There has to be really, that requires just a ton of space in itself.
Yeah, I think it's very strict. But I think it's almost like, I mean, you heard me struggling through that, like, because it's so hard to put what that is into this very structured approach. It's just, it doesn't fit. And it's like,
yeah. And I think the thought process with her was, I mean, if you look at like Jean Ayres, like her background is she was an OT bachelor's, but she got a PhD in neuroscience. So her focus was really to be a scientist and to find like a very standardized way to bring everything forth, because she wanted basically, she came up with this really amazing idea about, how can we treat children that, as she was talking about them, she talked about them as being learning disabled at the time. But talking about, these kids that have these developmental challenges, how do we approach this? And like now, there's a lot of people that thought she was crazy. And so her thought process was like, I have to come up with a standardized way to offer this treatment so that I can build the evidence base to provide it. However, in doing that, she also kind of put herself in a box, kind of essentially put practitioners in a box, because there's only but so many people who can do it the way it's supposed to happen. Like, the only place that I could really think of where it very likely is happening is at a place like the Star Center. Most of us cannot do that.
Jenny mentioned that it's very hard to control variables, and focusing on one type of treatment approach is a big mistake that we see happening a lot. Especially when we have the evidence to support it, which I think is so true. And I think I mean, Jenny, if you want to share too, feel free to interrupt me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. My point is, I just think it's a mistake, that we put so much focus in our profession in one treatment approach. And I think it's kind of like backfired on us a little bit, because now,
I agree.
ABA has kind of now become the gold standard working with they're evidence-based, and OT is not evidence-based. So, I think we really need to, talk about the use of so many different theories and frameworks that we have to pull from to support the children as best as we can.
I agree. I think part of the reason to consider too that, ABA calling themselves evidence-based, which they absolutely are, they have a lot of evidence, but they also, right out of the gate, were developed sort of with the psychological approach of, we're going to take a ton of evidence. So that's really what is the key for building their evidence base, is the fact that they're taking data by the second, versus a lot of times, I'm sure Katie, you could probably resonate with this, a lot of times with sensory treatment, us tracking data looks like improved in comparison to last session, or like better focus in this area. So like that to, of course, looking at that, somebody outside looking at that data is going to be like, what are they talking about? Yeah. Because that isn't data. That's like, unfortunately, our data.
Exactly, 100%. I agree. And, there is some question as to the validity of that data, but the fact that it's just only taking into account observable behaviors is concerning, and not taking into account anything, what's causing those behaviors. And I think that the Ayres SI is wonderful. Unfortunately, I just think it's not realistic. Like now, a lot of, we're focusing a lot more on parent coaching aspects. So we're doing a lot more in the home with the families. But like you said, that's not a type of a thing that can be done in a home environment. So it just makes it really tricky. I think honestly that teaching OTs how to collect data, more about what evidence-based practice is so important. Like I did a study on the use of evidence-based practice in school-based therapists, and the majority of them did not even know the definition of it.
Yeah, that tracks. That sounds about right.
Unless they had graduated last 5 years, they had no idea what it was. So I feel like it kind of went from one extreme where you have SI, which is, like you said, very strict, very structured. And then it went to the other extreme where people were just throwing any kind of SI intervention they could at the child. Well, let's give them a weighted vest. Let's give them this. Let's give them that. Well, first of all, if you give them, 5 interventions at once, you have no idea which one is working, if any of them are working.
Right.
So it's
Right.
almost like we have to be trained as a profession on how to look at an intervention, a singular intervention, and determine if that intervention is effective or not. And then if it's not, we move on to the next. But instead of this idea of just like throwing different things out there and seeing what sticks.
Yeah, we have to get better at taking data.
Yeah,
So.
I appreciate that point of one at a time too. I don't think I do that well, and that's definitely a good point, because you can't control those other variables. So unless you're doing just one thing, so I think that's a very good point. Also, Jenny, I'd love to learn more about that the study later on too. That's awesome. Well, yeah, I will. My goal for that session, or that it'll be like a live video, is to have a resource at the end that I will, be trialing myself to see if it works, and hopefully it's something that can be user friendly and put to track. I know a lot of like electronic health records are also trying to do this, but just to have something that you do yourself, that's kind of my goal. So look out for that. This has been an awesome discussion.